Logged into ML Studio, I'm going to go ahead and start a new experiment. And it's always good to give your experiments a name that will help you identify what they're being used for. If you guys remember from the previous lesson, the data that we uploaded was from a German credit card company that identifies credit risk. So we're going to name this experiment accordingly. So after I've done that, on the right hand, I can see saved data sets. And if I expand that, I can see where I have uploaded all of the data sets myself. And here's where I can find that German credit risk information. So I'm going to drag that out into the field. Once that's done, I can right click and visualize to see what the raw data actually looks like. And you guys can see there's about 100 rows of information in this raw data. And one important thing to note is that this data did not come with any column headings. And since that was the case, ML Studio assigned random column headings for these columns. The first thing we need to do in processing this data is assigning column names to these columns to help us identify what they are, for not only our knowledge, but also when we eventually publish this model in a web service, the headings help identify the columns to whoever will be using this service. So in order to identify the columns, we need to edit the metadata. So I'm going to drag the edit metadata module out into the field. I will link the raw data with edit metadata. And as you guys can see, a red exclamation mark shows up in the edit metadata module. That's because we have not set any properties for this. So in the properties pane on the right hand side, I'm going to launch the column selector. And I want to select all of the columns because none of the columns have any names assigned to them. And back in the properties pane on the right hand side, we can see a new column names option. This is where we're going to type in the names of the 21 columns in the data set, and each name needs to be separated by a comma. So our new column names should look something like this, where it has all of the 21 names. And as soon as that's done, you guys can see that the red exclamation mark is also gone. What I'm going to do now is run the experiment. And when I visualize the metadata, you guys can see that each of the columns now has a name associated with them to help us identify what these numbers actually mean. Next, in experiments, we need some data to train our model and some data to test that model. So what we're going to do now is split the data set into two separate data sets, one for training and one for testing. So I'm going to drag the split data module out into the field and connect the edit metadata with splitting the data. As you guys can see from the properties pane, ML Studio splits the data by default in a 50-50 fashion. 50% of the data will be output from the first port and 50% of the data will be outputted from the second port. And again, we can change this to whatever we want. If you want to use 60-40, 70-30, just depends on how much data we want to use to train the model, how much data we want to use to test the model. We're going to leave it as default and use equal amount of data for training and testing the model. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, for this credit card data, the cost of misclassifying a high credit risk as low is 5 times higher than the cost of misclassifying a low credit risk as high. So we need to account for this. And in order to do that, we're going to generate a simple R script. What that's going to do is each high risk is going to be replicated 5 times, while each low risk is not going to be replicated at all. So what that will do is even out the high risk and the low risk to help ML Studio predict an answer for us. In order to do that, we need to run a simple R script. So I will drag the execute R script module out into the field. And as you guys can see in the properties pane, by default, this is the R script that it will execute. So we go ahead and open that up. What we do is type in our customize R script. And we need to do this for both of the output ports of the split data, because again, one is used for testing, one is used for training. So we need to make sure that we do run the R script on both of these ports. The easiest way to do that, to replicate, is if we just copy and paste that same R script. And there you have it. What we've basically done in these few steps is pre-processed our data. So in the edit metadata, we have made this data useful by assigning those columns specific names. And by splitting the data and executing the R script, we've prepared the data for our specific problem because we've accounted for the high and low credit risk applicants. So thank you guys for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next lesson where we train and evaluate models.